The whole reason for this RFC is to write less, and it's gonna make us write more. We're doing an RFC read through today, but it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun. It's a clone with RFC, folks. This is really cool. When you think about it, PHP 1.8 had read-only properties. That's a while ago. So 1.8, that's already, I don't know, that's an eternity ago that PHP added read-only properties. It opened up the way for just using public read-only properties on classes and basically using data objects instead of trying to properly encapsulate data. You add read-only on it so that you don't have to use getters and setters, and it's read-only, so it can never change. So once the object has been constructed, you're certain that your data is safe and cannot be tampered with from the outside. That's why I like read-only properties, and that's all great until you run in some edge cases. Now, I use read-only properties all throughout my code for the past years. I love them because I like to structure my code in a way that I split functionality from data. And for data objects, it's so nice being able to just rely on PHP's type system and have a structured way of representing data and then passing that data to functions or other classes that do something with that data, and kind of like split these two concerns. And yeah, that really works well. Unless, of course, you want to make changes to read-only properties. So let me show you like the problem I run into. Let's say we have a class address. And, for brevity's sake, in PHP 8.2, there was the read-only class added where all properties are read-only, right? Street, number, is that the right thing? And postal code and city, something like this, right? So I like to use these kinds of objects all throughout my code. And it's really nice. I really like it because you always have, whenever you have an address, you know what's in it. And you know that if this object exists, it's valid. Possibly because you've done some validation over here, right? But the thing is, when you want to make changes to read-only objects, well, you cannot really do that, right? Yeah, this of course isn't allowed. PHP will crash. You cannot modify read-only property, and that's the goal of read-only properties. You don't have to add getters. You don't have to add setters because once the value has been set, it's good. We're certain that our data won't be tampered with. So what do you do when you do want to make changes to it? Well, you don't want to change the original object, right? Because then it can have unforeseen consequences. But if you make a copy of the object, create a new object with the same data, but one field changed, well, then you have a new object. The original one is still the same. Nothing unforeseen can happen, but still you've made a new version of that object. So how do we solve this case before PHP 8.5? Well, you cannot really clone the address. Okay, you've made a clone, but then you cannot set the other address street anymore because then, you'll just run into the same problem. Address street has been set during the cloning phase, and that's basically it. So you could add with methods, with street. And then you could do something like this, like return new self. The street is the overwritten value, and then over here we have our number, the copy from the original object. And this is all nice, but it doesn't really scale. It's very verbose, right? You need to write a lot of code if you want to be able to support all of these properties. And this is a very small object. You already need 4 methods, which is a lot of overhead. And in reality, we're talking about dozens of objects, dozens of properties. So you need a lot of code. And you can, of course, manually write all of this, but it gets so annoying very fast. So then what people do, or what I do, I'm a lazy developer, right? I just remove the read-only, which isn't really correct. And I know that, but I also know that people aren't very likely to tamper with my data, but it's not a good approach. I like to have that certainty that if I have an object of address, it cannot be tampered with directly. So another option is have some kind of generic method. And it's been a while since I've written that, but let's see, you could do something like clone equals new reflection class over this, and then instance without constructor. So if you dump the clone, then the object was constructed, but there are no properties set. And then of course you could do something. It's been a while since I've written this, but so over here you would say street. There are a couple more things you would need to do, but I'm taking a shorthand here. So we're casting our object to an array. So data equals data in args. And I actually think then we can do for each data as key value, we can say clone key value basically. So now we have a reusable method, and that's pretty cool. You do want to do some more validation, and casting to arrays probably, well, it's very, very naive, but you know, you can wrap this up into a trait and use it on whatever kind of data objects with read-only properties, and then, you know, get this functionality. And this is pretty nice. The problem I find with this approach is that there's no auto-completion, right? You don't get a list of, well, AI gives me a list, but you don't really get a list of what properties are available here, which I really don't like. The good thing is this is now in PHP. But there are a lot of side notes to make, so that's what we're going to look into. So both read-only properties and the cloning of objects are commonplace in a lot of PHP applications. Yes, definitely. But these two concepts don't fully work together in all cases. So basically the RFC is going to explain the problem I just talked about. And then it's going to introduce a new syntax. It is kind of the same as what we're used to with clone, right? So clone address. But you can now also wrap it in brackets here and then pass in an array of other data. Street, Baker Street 2, and then number 2022. Of course, PHP Storm is complaining here because this syntax isn't supported yet. But if we run it on PHP master branch, it doesn't work. Let's remove read-only for a second, because this is the second issue I want to tell you about. So, okay, object, the street has been changed, the number has been changed, the other properties have been copied over. And so this is on PHP's master branch, so PHP 8.5, right? This isn't on my local machine yet, but this is running through eval.org. And this is really great, except that there are a couple of side notes to make. So let's go through them one by one. The first one is that issue you saw earlier, right? So apparently, and this is going to be a bit technical to explain, and I'm going to remove read-only here, and I'm going to add it over here, just for this one property. Cannot modify protected set read-only property address street. What is that about? You know, this is a public property. Why is it protected set? Does anyone know? Can anyone tell me? Well, when asymmetric visibility was added, they looked at read-only properties. And so asymmetric visibility, if you don't know, by the way, you can define the visibility for write and read access separately. So you can make a property public get, so public readable, but only private settable. But public get basically is public private set, and then there's a shorthand private set. But you can make a property only writable from within the private context and then readable from everywhere else. You can also make it protected set, right? And again here, because it's public is the default basically. So if you have a protected set property, PHP will assume that it's public by default, and then the set access has been changed. Okay, so when this feature was added, they had to do something with read-only properties. Read-only properties are a bit weird, right? Because read-only properties, they are public read-only properties, that is. They are publicly readable, but they can only be written once, and that's it. And so what they decided in the asymmetric visibility RFC, and this makes sense, is that they had to define some kind of default visibility for public read-only properties and visibility for write access, right? And they decided to do this. So public protected set read-only. Now, this is all just implied by making a read-only public property. So this basically gets automatically added behind the scenes, and you don't have to write it manually every time. And they did this because when read-only properties were added initially, I think in PHP 8.1 we just learned, they were more likely private sets, right? We didn't have a concept of private set like asymmetric visibility. That wasn't a thing yet, but the thing it most resembles was that you can only set a read-only property from within its constructor. That's not entirely true, but private set was kind of like the thing that most accurately represents it. The problem is, private set, whenever you extend an object with a read-only property, then you cannot set it anymore from within that child object. So they decided, okay, let's make it protected set. So for normal properties, when you have a normal public property, that is, this means public read and public write. But when it's a read-only property instead of public set, they make it public and protected set. And so this just, goes on behind the scenes because you don't write these things. They are just, handled by the engine behind the scenes. And it kind of makes sense when you're using read-only properties, because 99% of the cases, you're setting the value within the object itself. You can technically say foo equals new foo. There's no constructor here, right? So this is valid PHP. This runs. As long as you don't access that property, even though it's unset, PHP won't complain. But as soon as you try to read it and it doesn't have a value, PHP will say like type property must not be accessed before initialization. It does mean that you can set the value outside of the object itself, so bar equals bar. Problem here is that this isn't just public read-only, this is protected set. Protected set, read-only. But PHP just hides that from us. And then you run into this problem. Cannot modify protected set read-only property. Of course not, because you're trying to set it from outside the scope. This rarely happens. It makes sense that it's protected set. Why would you want to set a value of a read-only property, something that's only set once? Why would you want to do that outside of the object? Like the 99% use case is that this happens in the constructor, right? Where you do some validation on the input and you're done. Your object is created and you cannot change it anymore. So that's great. But now we have clone with. And clone with is kind of like the goal of clone with is to be able to do this from the outside. We created an address, right? And we say clone with. And we're going to talk about the syntax in a second. Hold your horses. We say clone with. And we say, okay, these are the properties we want to override. Street, at least, is a read-only property. And it can only be set from, by default, from the protected scope. So not from the outside, which is what clone with is doing. So there are two ways to solve this. If you want to use clone with, you either remove read-only, but that's kind of like the whole reason we need clone with is because of read-only properties. This works. It's not read-only anymore. It's overwritten. Life is good. It's read-only, doesn't work. So what you could do instead of protected set, well, you can overwrite this. Of course, you can make it public set. PHP Storm has some problems highlighting this because this is redundant. It's already public. Yeah, well, it's not the case when it's read-only. That's a bug in PHP Storm. I created an issue for that. So let's do it like this. So you make the property public set read-only, and then suddenly it works. But that means that if we want to use clone with public read-only properties, we'll have to explicitly say public set for every property, and then it will work. This is really annoying, folks. Clone with the RFC addresses this issue. It's not an issue that's introduced because of the clone with RFC. They decided to not touch this read-only default visibility stuff within the clone with RFC, because that way there was a more likely chance that the RFC would fail, right? Because the scope of the RFC is too big. However, the major reason I and many other people want clone with is so that we don't have to do this from within the class anymore. It is so that you can just whip up something on the fly, clone an object from whatever scope and override some of its properties. And yeah, we're not gonna add public set everywhere. That's pretty stupid. Now this protected set stuff, I cannot write protected, but this stuff, it can still change. There can be a follow-up RFC to change this, and I hope there will be. Because having to write this is just really annoying. But it means that for now, and we're nearing feature freeze here, I haven't read through the internals mailing list. So if someone knows in chat or in the comments afterwards, if they're already working on this, please let me know. I'm not gonna write public set everywhere. No, The whole reason for this RFC is to write less, and it's gonna make us write more. One of the things you could do, instead of doing all of this, we could now do exactly, we could do this, clone this, and then arcs, basically. So our whole like reflection magic thing got reduced to one line, and now it works because we're making the actual clone from within the object itself, within the private scope, within the or protected scope, and it works. And you could move this to a trait and then use that everywhere. And so the implementation of this with method becomes a bit easier, but you still don't have autocompletion here, which is the thing I need, because maybe I'm a noob developer here, but I'm not able to remember like dozens of objects with dozens of properties on top of my head, right? That doesn't work. I'm maybe call me stupid developer, but I need some autocompletion here. And yeah, with this approach, it doesn't work. Okay, that brings us to my second problem, the syntax. But I can live with it. I can live with it. If the read-only stuff gets fixed, I will use clone with. It's so unfortunate though that we're stuck with this syntax, with an array of all things, with textual keys even. That's so unfortunate because now, like in textual keys, there isn't any autocompletion by default. I'm sure PHP Storm will add autocompletion here. Of course, that's a given, but still you have to write the quotes. You have to write the fat arrow. You know, why couldn't it be other address? Let's see, this is what I wanted. Clone equals clone address. And then, you know, curly brackets, you know, street, Baker Street 2, something like this. How nice would that be? Would be pretty similar to get and set hooks now that we have them as well. So I don't know, this is pretty cool. Don't you think? No, not gonna happen. The reason they chose arrays, as is listed in the RFC, is because they felt like the feature wasn't important enough to warrant a new syntax. And because there is a breaking change, oh sorry, clone with, I wrote a mistake here. This is what I would do. Or maybe this is cool as well, but this is like syntax that doesn't exist in PHP. There's now a with keyword that's getting reserved, so that's a breaking change. You get these curly brackets that open up a new scope. That's weird. Maybe you could do it like this, but that's a bit weird as well, right? So I don't know, I guess it kind of makes sense that they just used it within clone, but maybe this would have been nice as well then. Street, Baker Street 2, something like this, without having to pass in an array. Actually, now that I've written this, why not this way? Honestly. Oh, it's so much cleaner than having to wrap it in an array. I don't like. They chose the array they write in the RFC because it's the least impactful way to do it. They could fit in this feature like pretty easily. Which, okay, fair point. But I'm not really a fan of it. But I'll deal with it. It's getting like, it's not changing anymore, I reckon. By the way, this is in no way me criticizing the RFC authors, because I think they did a really great job. There was already a previous RFC for clone with that failed, you know, because the RFC was too complex, too big. So they really tried to narrow the scope of the RFC so that it would pass. And I think that makes sense. But if you then combine the fact that it's a kind of like syntax I don't really like, with the fact that it doesn't work for my, and I know many other people, my 95% use case of cloning public read-only properties, then it becomes a bit less exciting for me. Okay, so my final remark here, maybe the elephant in the room, something that you're already thinking about, is the clone method here. Because how does the clone method work in PHP? The magic clone method. Let's see, object cloning. When an object is cloned, PHP will perform a shallow copy of all the object's properties. A shallow copy means that if there are other objects within the original object, those objects aren't cloned as well. They are just the references copied over. Oh, any properties that are references to other variables will remain references. If you want like a true copy of your whole object, you have to recursively go through all the object's properties, right? Once the cloning is complete, if a clone method is defined, then the newly created object's clone method will be called to allow any necessary properties that need to be changed. So in other words, echo hi. So when you end up here, the object has been cloned. You're in the clone. Let me actually show that. So var dump SPL object ID this, and then SPL object ID address, okay? So the first one is 1 and the second one is 2. So this over here is already the cloned object, right? So it's a new object, but the properties that were passed to with this array haven't been set yet. So you have your original properties, and you can basically still do all the things you need to do in clone as just like before, and only then the new properties are set up. So this is the original property still. You could still make changes here. Like for example, for deep copies, if you have a reference to city, for example, you could say like this city equals clone this city, so that you get a deep copy of the original object. The problem here is that I would have liked if args, if this array was passed into here. I think that would have made a lot of sense. That's the side note of clone. There's no arguments passed into it, but it's in the future scope, right? Allow clone to inspect the with properties array to skip deep cloning properties that will be overwritten. So yeah, there's clone with. And I have 3 problems with it. First problem is public set versus protected set for read-only properties. And this is a big one. For me, for my use cases, it makes this feature like totally useless. I'm sorry to say. I wanted this so that I didn't have to make specific with methods on my object or use a trait. Weird syntax? I don't know. This is subjective. I'll get over it, you know? And then the third one, being able to pass with properties to clone. So yeah, the idea is there, and this might be fixed in the future. I don't know when. I really think that this should have been part of the RFC to begin with. Yeah, the weird syntax, as I say, I'll get over it. It's unfortunate, but if this is what it takes to get internals convinced to accept this, then I'm okay. I'll get over it. And then this one, they're gonna add it in the future, and I think it makes sense that they kept it out of the RFC just to keep it like smaller in scope. I am reminded of the property hooks RFC last year from Larry, and I read through it. Like this was that massive RFC. With the clone with RFC, they kind of went the opposite way and stripped as much as they could from the RFC. They mentioned this as well somewhere actually. See. With protected set right now, note this is how read-only properties work in PHP currently, and any change would be outside the scope of this RFC. So they really deliberately limited the scope of the RFC, which is, I would say, is a wise thing. But on the other hand, property hooks also got accepted. So, but okay, let's also acknowledge the fact that people are limited on time, and this is what it is, and that's good as well. It just leads to a feature that I feel isn't like ready for use yet. So yeah, and now I want to go on like a kind of philosophical rant maybe, but the main problem for PHP, I feel, is that whatever RFC you make, right, it has to be perfect from the start. There is no room for error, because once it's in the language, you cannot make any changes to it anymore. And I feel like this RFC is suffering from that kind of fate as well, because like they tried to trim it down as much as possible so that it had a chance of succeeding, and it did. But then, you know, we're left with a very bare bones RFC that doesn't actually address the issue that it was trying to solve. Well, no, they changed the objective of the feature so that it did solve some issues, and it still does. Like, it's still useful, right, in some cases, but Like the main reason we wanted this is read-only properties, cloning read-only public properties. The RFC even starts this way. Let me go back. Both read-only properties and the cloning of objects are commonplace in a lot of PHP applications, but these two concepts don't fully work together in all cases. True! And they still don't really do after this RFC. So, yeah, I don't know. PHP would benefit from a way to introduce experimental features. I'm just gonna I think this is the solution, honestly. Nikita was looking into additions when Nikita was still working on PHP. Additions where you could have like opt-in features basically, and then you could have experimental features, and then you could iterate over those experimental features. But you can like imagine a code base the size of PHP and then having to add flags basically like, oh yeah, this feature is opt-in, and when you use this opt-in feature, suddenly 500 other things change. I know that's so difficult to work with. As some of you might know, I'm working on this framework called Tempest, and we released a 1.0 version. And we were like, but we're not perfect. We're making mistakes. Who are we to say that that it's perfect now and that it will work and that we haven't forgotten about anything? Well, let me tell you something. We forgot about a lot of things. But what we did up front is that we tagged 1.0 because people didn't really want to use it before 1.0 because they're like, oh, it's still in development, it's beta. I get that. It's okay. Now people really want to use it. But now only we're discovering like, okay, maybe there are some things that should have been different. And so what we did is we marked a couple of components on Tempest as experimental. And we said like, okay, these things will probably change a little bit. Like we know we're in the right direction, but we know we don't have it perfect yet. Still, we want to work on this and we want people to start using it and to discover together with us what should be improved. And marking features as experimental, like we're not gonna like totally change everything from one day to another, but it gives us a little bit of wiggle room to fine tune the things that the mistakes, the oversights, you know? And that's what PHP is missing. Like it has to be perfect from the get-go because now it's getting into PHP 8.5. And then what? Then what? It's going to stay here for not eternity. Maybe until the next major PHP version, which I think PHP 9, I don't think we'll get PHP 8.10. Probably. So, I mean, one of the next versions will probably be PHP 8, PHP 9. So, and then they might like introduce some breaking changes. But this like clone width should have been an experimental feature, and it should have changed read-only property, public read-only access to like public set by default instead of protected set. And then people could like start playing around with it. And the people who did, they accept the fact that, okay, things might still change a little bit, and that's fine. And we know that with the next PHP 8.6 or PHP 8.7, maybe there will be some breakage. I'm okay with that. I am okay with that, honestly. But we don't have that. We don't have that in PHP. We're here stuck, and it has to be perfect from the get-go. Or it's not perfect and we still have to live with it for years to come. So yeah, I don't know. It's almost getting emotional here. It's fine. I'm doing okay. But, and yeah. I do want to like highlight once more, like Volker and Tim worked on this RFC. And Tim messaged me asking like, hey, can you review it after it was voted in? I got a message a couple of days ago. So yeah, Tim and Volker, like great work. Don't take this as like a personal insult. I think you worked within like the boundaries and you came up with a like a compromise. And yeah, that I understand. I do hope that the protected set stuff gets fixed as soon as possible, because then this feature will be usable. It's unfortunate that we don't have experimental features or something like. But anyway, it turned out to be a rant with Brent. I don't know why I feel so like passionate about this. I think like I remember read-only properties being added, and it really revolutionized how I wrote PHP code. And clone width was one of these things that I really struggled with for years now, that it wasn't in the language. So I was kind of excited for it. But yeah, it doesn't work how I had hoped to. But maybe it will change. So I'll be hopeful. Maybe we'll have to wait another couple of years. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. You know what to do. That being said, I'll see you in the next one. Okay? Bye-bye.